Good morning, everyone, and we're back with 5 before the bell here on Tuesday, the 5th of September. Rest, tanned, and relaxed from the Labor Day weekend, I hope. I certainly am. Well, not tanned, but rest and relaxed nonetheless. And we're going to take you through those 5 things you need to know before the bell. I'm Martin Baccardax. I'm the London Bureau Chief here at TheStreet.com, and we're here in the heart of the financial district in central London at the studios of Core TV. It's been an interesting day, and we're going to take a look at what's happening in European markets right now because we're pulling back a little bit, but we had an actually relatively bullish start to the session. Asia was tepid. Of course, investors there are still concerned about the increasing rhetoric around North Korea and the tensions after it tested the hydrogen bomb on Sunday. We had a significant decline in markets yesterday, but a pullback today, and actually we were looking at green across the board for much of the session in Europe. Now, we had relatively solid economic data. That was part of the reason, and we had a little bit of a pullback in regional currencies, and that was another. But I think ultimately investors are getting a little bit inured to the political risk on the table, even though it is significant, and we are hearing increasing belligerence, not only from North Korea, but from the United States and others in and around the region. Now, there is a report from South Korean news that North Korea is prepared to test another missile in the coming days. And of course, that would be significantly troubling given the fact that the bomb itself may be small enough, I beg your pardon, the bomb that was tested over the weekend could theoretically be small enough to fit on the head of a missile, the type of which have been tested on several occasions over the past few months. So maybe just part of the collective concern with respect to that is what's pulling U.S. futures into the red at the moment and actually pulling European stocks a little bit lower. But that said, Germany's still looking at a 0.4% gain. The markets here in the United Kingdom are pulling back just a little bit, but more broadly, the sentiment is cautiously positive, and I do wonder if Wall Street may not turn green as we get closer to the bell and the session advances. We're going to move on to a very important summit in and around the Asia region today. It was in the port city of Xiamen in China. It's the BRIC Summit. BRIC is an acronym that was created about 15 years ago by a former Goldman Sachs economist, and it means Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It was meant to represent the burgeoning emerging markets. Now, the BRIC Summit that's being held today in China is also including South Africa and several other economies in and around the region. Now, that in itself is not necessarily news, although the fact that these economies have collectivized to the point where they can hold regular summits is indeed important. What was important of note to me, at the very least, was the fact that we had broadsides that were fired against President Donald Trump by both the leaders of China and Russia, and they were very pointed and very specific and represent a deepening isolation of the president's foreign and economic policies. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, was probably the most significant in that he said that sanctions against North Korea are ineffective. He basically said they were a waste of time. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that the North Koreans can eat grass, but they're not going to give up their atomic weapons program. And he urged more constraint with respect to international support for Pyongyang's security, which they are increasingly concerned about as a result of the U.S. reaction. Now, President of China, Xi Jinping, was also speaking at the BRICS Summit, and he talked about the rising tide of protectionism around the world and the fact that some countries are growing more inward-looking with their trade and economic policies. There's no secret as to who he was speaking about, even though he didn't name the United States, and I think that's an interesting development indeed when you talk about the fact that the president is looking at ways to extract himself from NAFTA, has pulled out of a Pan-Pacific trade agreement, and of course has withdrawn from the Paris Accord on climate change. So it is interesting to me that you were seeing leaders who are, it has to be said, incredibly important in the global dynamic, criticizing, if not directly, indirectly, policies in which the president is nailing his colors to the mast on. And that will have an interesting development dynamic in the coming months as the president tries to collectivize support for the sanctions against North Korea and tries to gather a way in which he can get support for other methods in which he could use to tame Pyongyang and the region itself. Now, that is going to be no small task, but considering that he has lost a great deal of political capital in the past months on Paris, on trade, on economic policies, on immigration, it only makes that task increasingly difficult. So I do think that this has dimensions, particularly when you consider that the president is talking about cutting trade ties with any country that does business with North Korea. China is probably the most significant. China does about $600 billion worth of trade with the United States each and every month, and the dimensions of that are so important that it's it's not even worth thinking about what would happen if trade ties were cut completely, because it simply won't happen. But nonetheless, the deeper the president's rhetoric becomes, the more difficult it is for him to extricate himself from the red lines that he promised us all he wasn't going to draw. We're going to move back to the United States now and talk about a developing story with respect to Hurricane Irma, because it was upgraded to a Category 4 storm by the National Weather Service only last night and is heading towards the coast of Puerto Rico and may make landfall late Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning. Category 4 means that the storm is going to have wind speeds of around 150 miles an hour, and the Weather Service is warning about catastrophic damage as a result. Uprooted trees, down power lines, you name it. And the fact is that the path of the storm is now shifting a little bit and may hit the coast of Florida and in around Dade and Broward County in the city of Miami. It'll also move its way up the east coast of the United States as well. Miami, of course, still has bitter memories of Hurricane Andrew and the devastation that that wrought, so they're taking no chances. Governor Rick Scott has declared a state of emergency, and I know very close friends in the Miami area who are stocking up on water and food and are talking about significant lines at grocery stores and petrol stations as a result. I should say gas stations. I've obviously been here too long. But that story is interesting because, of course, it comes as residents in and around Texas, Houston, and Louisiana are picking up the pieces from the devastation that was wrought by Hurricane Harvey. Now, the Governor Greg Abbott has said that that could total around $180 billion US as the floodwaters recede and we get a better assessment of what damage was actually wrought. And at the moment, it does seem that that number might be accurate. We're talking about perhaps in the region of 70 to 90 billion prior to the receding of the floodwaters. That seemed to be the industry peg on the ultimate damage. But what I noticed today was that European reinsurance stocks were actually lagging the broader market recovery. So I do think that investors are growing a little bit concerned as to what hit they are going to take as a result of the cost of the hurricanes and, of course, the impending damage that may be brought from Hurricane Irma. And as I said, Governor Scott is taking no chances in declaring that state of emergency. As a sidebar, it looks like gasoline futures are dropping very, very quickly and, in fact, are trading at levels that we saw prior to the landfall of Hurricane Harvey on the 26th of August. So we're back down to about $1.68 per barrel. It's probably not going to manifest itself at the pumps anytime soon, and for the next few days, you can imagine we're going to stick to these two-week highs. But nonetheless, as we told you last week, it does seem that those gas price increases aren't going to last in any significant way, and already you're seeing pipelines and refiners and production units coming back online. They're not to full speed yet, but they will be relatively shortly. Again, if there's no secondary damage as a result of the storm, so it does seem the gas prices may recede, and it's certainly going to be good news for the American consumer. We're going to move on to another story in the United States, which is interesting, and sometimes we're guilty in the media of being a little bit obsessed with media deals, but nonetheless, I do think this is one worth talking about, because we're looking at the sale of the Daily News newspaper in New York to Tronc Media Group. Now, that is a group that controls newspapers in Baltimore, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, and other metropolitan cities around the United States. It was sold for the princely sum of $1, which is probably what you'd pay to pick up a copy of the paper on the street, but of course, they're going to have to pay contingent liabilities of about $30 million US, and I'm reading reports of pension liabilities. It could be another $100 million. It's interesting, though, in the sense that this is a really distinctive newspaper in the city of New York, the biggest in the United States, and one that has sort of, I guess if you will, created the tone of tabloid newspaper reporting in the United States and has been responsible for some of the most famous headlines in all of American media history. My favorite, of course, goes back to the late 1970s when New York City was bankrupt and looking for support from the federal government. The Daily News ran the headline that read simply, "Ford to City, drop dead." One of the most amazing headlines of all time. But when you think back to the ways that the Daily News has shaped the city of New York and the way that it has consumed media, it is quite astonishing. I'm looking at a page from the, obviously from the late 1940s, Hitler dead, basically just illustrating the historic nature of this newspaper, which is 100 years old, and of course is going to be sold now to the Tronc Media Group for the princely sum of $1. Interesting, too, in the sense that these are companies that are that the most influential newspapers outside of the New York Times, which is a public company, do tend to be owned by either single investors or large and established families. The Boston Globe being one of them, the Washington Post, which of course is owned by a division that is controlled by Jeff Bezos of Amazon.com, being another. So this newspaper going into a broader stable seems to sort of buck that trend, but nonetheless, Tronc is pretty confident that it can manage growth in the digital age when we are seeing, of course, people consuming the news in a very different way than they did only a couple of years ago, and certainly completely different to the way that they did back in the late 70s and early 80s when the New York Daily News was at its heyday, and Jimmy Breslin was really defining the way in which columnists were contributing to the news development in the United States and really controlling the sense of the way that news was reported and then ultimately consumed by people not only in the United States but around the rest of the world. So that's an interesting one for us, and we'll keep an eye on developments in the coming days. Now, as I say, Wall Street is called a little bit lower at the start of trading. We're looking at the Dow giving back. It's not too bad, though, about 10 points at the opening bell. S&P 500 may be giving back about 1 to 1.5 points, and the NASDAQ may be falling, well, probably, I'm going to call that little changed from the Friday close. It's not bad going when you consider the fact that Wall Street didn't get a chance to trade yesterday's declines as a result of the Labor Day holiday. Now, what I did notice, however, was that U.S. Treasury bond yields didn't fall as much as you might anticipate in a flight to safety trade, because we're still looking at about $1,300 an ounce, or $1,330, I should say, an ounce for gold, and that's near 11-month highs. So the flight to safety, you would typically see lower Treasury bond yields, but they're trading at about 213, 214. So that does suggest to me that there should be some bullish drive into the market once trading begins, and I'll be surprised if we end the day in the red, but of course, you never know. One of the big stories that we're going to have to take a look at from a single stock perspective is the Rockwell Collins deal. It's been purchased by United Technologies for $30 billion. That's an enterprise value. It's an equity value of about $23 billion. It's going to create an aerospace giant that is going to, well, hopefully take on some of the European rivals and certainly those in the United States. Pretty big deal. Both stocks, though, are called a little bit lower at the opening bell, and we'll see how that one shakes through. But nonetheless, that's a pretty significant deal in the aerospace industry, and of course, that industry has been under some significant cost pressure since the election of Donald Trump last year and his shots across the bow of the costs of certain aviation systems for the U.S. military and the U.S. government. So we'll watch that one with interest. Oil prices are gaining just a little bit, both on a Brent perspective and a WTI perspective. But as I say, gasoline futures have been tumbling over the past couple of days as refiners come back online, and futures prices are looking at those levels that we saw prior to the landfall of Hurricane Harvey on the 26th of August. Well, that's it from us here from Central London and Core TV, and for indeed 5 before the bell for Tuesday, the 5th of September. I'm Martin Baccardax, London Bureau Chief here at TheStreet.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.